What's up? This is a random video. But I wanted to make this... God, that looks terrible. I wanted to make this video mostly because it sparked my interest. And I just watched... I've been going down the rabbit hole. Similar topics, so this I figured I'd pop on and just spout my nonsense. A little bit about moi. I've wanted to be in law enforcement for as long as I can remember. I actually have 2 college degrees related to law enforcement, one in law enforcement. I've always wanted to investigate homicide. It's always been my particular interest. So that's the backstory. I've consumed a lot of literature, documentaries on serial killers, and I was going down the rabbit hole earlier, and I came across a serial killer that I hadn't thought about in a while, which is the Long Island serial killer, or Lisk. Now, if you've not seen it, AE did a documentary, I don't remember what it's called, on Lisk. There's other serial killers that were involved, but Lisk was like 3 of the episodes. Now, this case is... it's a really interesting case. There have been, as of, I believe, 2019 or 2020, there have been 16 bodies that have been found on essentially what is like a 10-mile stretch of beach. 4 of them were discovered almost equally spaced apart from each other. Most of the victims were sex workers. Some of the bodies were beyond recognition and were unable to be identified by DNA or dental records. In a couple of the cases, the skulls of the heads of the victims were removed. So dental records would be obviously useless in that case. There have been a lot of theories, though, about who the identity of this particular serial killer might be. Now, the A&E documentary mentions they bring in sort of amateur detectives, people who, you know, they read serial killer literature and they follow news stories, and then they sort of post theories about what might be going on. And in the A&E documentary, they start off with the assumption that it's one killer responsible for all of these victims, and then they then move on to the possibility of it being 2 different killers. And the reason they end up going to that particular direction is because the disposal mechanism of the victims changed. Now, for my particular 2 cents on this, that is one metric that law enforcement uses to determine whether or not a crime or series of crimes were committed by one individual or multiple individuals. Serial killers, and this is true of criminals in general, but it's particularly relevant in this conversation because it's serial killers, have what's called an MO. Now, an MO, it's Latin, it's an abbreviation for modus operandi, which is basically mode of operation. The translation on that might be a little off, but that's essentially what it is. It's the system that the offender uses for everything from the pre-planning of the crime to the disposal and or concealment of evidence after the crime. Now, it is true that changes in MO typically are not that common amongst killers. If you go back and you look at established serial killers, ones that you can link to multiple victims, usually the MO doesn't change that much. And that's because they start off their careers, if you want to call it that, and they're sort of discovering what works. And then once they find something that works, they typically will stay with that for a really long time. Now, you can have variations in the way that MO is manifested, but the broad strokes usually stay the same. What's interesting about the Lisk killings is that the 4 victims that were found on Gilgo Beach were found wrapped in burlap sacks. And again, they were almost evenly spaced from the information that I've seen, um, versus the other victims that were found in plastic sacks. And so this has led some people to think that it might not be the same offender. It might be 2 offenders. I disagree with that. I don't see how, again, the greater the population in any one area, the higher the crime. And this is true most commonly you see this with drug crime. More people equals more drugs. That's true literally everywhere. But it's also true for property crime. Drug crime increases, violent crime increases. Typically, you can see almost a causal, if not a causal relationship between drug crime going up and violent crime going up. So, but again, population equals more crime. There are a lot of people who live on Long Island. It's Long Island, New York. But the thing that strikes me so strange about the assertion there's 2 killers is, what are the chances that 2 people are engaging in serial murder and both of them use the exact same dumping ground? Again, like a 10-mile stretch of beach, if 10 miles. I don't even think it's that long. What are the chances of that? Like I said, I've consumed a lot of serial killer literature. Read a lot of true crime stuff on serial killers. Watched a lot of serial killer documentaries. I can't think of a single instance where you had serial killers dispose of victims in the same place ever. Ever. And again, it's not like you're talking about like a forest in Washington somewhere, or a desert in Utah, or the moors in Britain. Or like this large geographical area where, that would work because there's this mass space that you can use for victim disposal. You're talking about a very small stretch of land. What are the chances of that? I think they're almost zero. I don't think that makes sense. As for who the killer probably is, there are a couple of suspects. One of them is a former, I think, direct police chief who was disgraced. He has his own rather glorious criminal record. There's a serial killer who was operating in that area, or not a serial killer, but a guy who was convicted of, I believe it was 2 murders of sex workers in that area. I believe it's called McMinnville. There were phone calls that were placed from one of the victims to McMinnville, according to the victim's mother. So there's a bit of a connection with that. I don't have a person. I'm not familiar enough with the case to have a person in mind. But I think it's a cop. I think that the Long Island serial killer is either a police officer, current or retired, or it's somebody who has a law enforcement member in their family. And there are a couple of reasons that I say that. In the A&E documentary, they go to the dump sites of 4 of these victims at night, and it's pitch black. You can't see anything. And it got me thinking about what happens if, say, somebody's driving down a dark road in the middle of the night, and they see a car on the side of the road. There's no lights on, the car's not running, there's no one in it. There's a pretty good chance that that car is going to get called into the cops. Someone's going to call and say, hey, there's a car out here, it looks like it's abandoned, there's no one in it, it's not running, all the lights are off, it's pitch black, you can't see it. And there's also a pretty good chance that an officer would rock up to that car and take a peek at it, and then either call it in, which any smart police officer should do, right? You get the license plate number and you run it, so then you get a name of whoever it is, just so then you can, if nothing else, just go like next to the car and just start yelling. See if the person maybe is having like a medical emergency, pulled off to the side of the road, got out of the car, and now is like unconscious out there somewhere or got lost. But you would have a record of that, right? Most likely, there's a pretty good chance, especially you're talking about 16 victims. Chances are very good they were not disposed of at the same time, even two at the same time. That's really risky. So you're talking about 16 individual times that this person went to this same dumping ground. You would think, if it's just a normal civilian car, a normal civilian, that somebody would have called that in at some point. But if it's a cop car, and you're driving, and it's late at night, dark road, no lights along the road, right? Or very few. And you're in a section between lights, and it's pitch black, and as you're driving, you see a cop car on the side of the road. All the lights are off, and it's not running. Most people aren't going to get out to see if the cop is still in the car. And no one's going to think to call that in, because it's a cop. There's nothing weird about him sitting on the side of the road. You don't know if he's sitting in there just on a break, taking a nap when he's not supposed to be, or if he's got a speed gun and he's just, waiting to see if anybody comes by speeding, or if he's just watching to see if people are going to come down without any headlights on, or a burned out headlight, or whatever. You don't know. So right there, you've got one possible reason why it's been so hard to find this person is because if it's a cop parked on the side of the road, disposing of a body, no one's going to interrupt him. No one's going to call the cops and say, hey, there's a car out here that looks like it's abandoned, right? And if another cop rocks up, all he has to do is come out of the brush there, because there is brush by the road, so you can't see to the other side where the ocean is. All he has to do is just come out, Other officer asks him, hey, man, you all right? And this guy goes, yeah, man, I'm doing good. Thanks for asking. You have yourself a nice night. Gets back in his car and leaves. And guess what? You could have a body 10 feet away from you behind the brush. Guy leaves, you turn around, walk back in, and do what you're going to do. The fact that so little physical evidence has been found leads me to think that it's a cop. Somebody who's familiar with law enforcement techniques and strategies. Hands were removed and heads were removed from some of the victims found in plastic sacks. So, again, fingerprints and dental records were, can't be used in that case. Several of the victims were skeletonized. Means of death, I don't think were recorded for a lot of the victims. Once you get to a skeletonized state, it's very difficult to determine cause of death outside of a couple of obvious ones, right? So, like sharp force trauma, something like, say, with a knife or a machete. Blunt force trauma, so an axe, a hammer, a crowbar, any blunt object, a brick, something along those lines. What else? You could have, say, like a broken neck. Can be usually can be seen even in a skeletonized body. You can see the fractures in the spine. That can give you an indication that somebody's neck was broken. But again, if it's it becomes harder to determine how somebody dies. And if you're a cop and you're familiar with what shows up on a body, what's easy to identify, and you're purposely trying to avoid setting a pattern, then you just simply wouldn't kill your victims that way. It just seems like so much of the stuff lines up for being a cop, right? The fact that the disposal site is where it is. It's isolated. A cop would be fine there. There are signs all over this area about vehicles not being allowed past certain points. But again, a cop could go past there and no one would think anything of it. You've got the fact that no physical evidence has been found on these victims. No DNA evidence, no hairs, no nothing that ties any of these victims to one single person. You get the fact that it's happened on such a small stretch of beach. It's obviously somebody who's very familiar with the area. And again, it almost seems like it's somebody who, even if they were seen, it wouldn't matter. And again, to me, that says it's a cop. Even if he's seen near where a body is later discovered, no one's going to think anything of it because it was a cop. It's not going to stand out to you. The MO change that I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest reasons why people think it was two killers and not one is because of the fact that the MO changed. Again, though, most serial killers, they settle into a pattern because they're predators. And like all predators, once they discover a way of hunting something that works, they typically will follow that same pattern. Now, times of extreme stress can cause variations in the exact execution of the plan and can cause them to do things they normally don't do. Say, like most ants, say you have an animal that primarily is a hunter. In times of extreme stress, they might scavenge more, right? So, extreme outside pressure can cause alterations in predatory behavior, but very often, so long as the environmental conditions remain stable, the predators will operate the same way over and over and over again because it works. Serial killers are no different. The MO becomes a pattern, and patterns become muscle memory, they become reflex. And what happens is, the moment it becomes reflex, cognitively, you're not paying as much attention. And that's where you see serial killers make mistakes. They get comfortable in their routine. They get comfortable in the victim selection, the mechanism of kill, the location of the kill, the manner they dispose of the body. They get comfortable in these things. And then they start to make mistakes. Right? Because again, it becomes pattern, it becomes reflex, it becomes muscle memory. Less actual focus on what they're doing, more just going with the motions. Same thing is true, say, of somebody who, like, say, works in a deli, slicing meat for years. At first, you're very conscious of that fact that you're working with this equipment because you don't want to hurt yourself. But as time goes on, you get more comfortable. And then one day, you cut yourself. Why? Because it was muscle memory and you weren't paying as much attention and you made a mistake. Same thing is true, say, somebody who drives. In the beginning, you're very conscious of the fact that you're driving and it's dangerous. But as time goes on, you settle into a pattern, into a habit, into a routine, and it becomes muscle memory. And then you make a shortcut, you don't do something, and you get into an accident. The pattern ends up being what gets you caught because you make a mistake somewhere. And and here's the other thing that's so important about that. Because it's a pattern, you won't notice the mistake. Because in your mind, you did everything this time the same way you did it last time. And if you didn't make a mistake last time, then you didn't make a mistake this time. Okay? Another reason why it's most likely a cop, and the reason it explains the MO change. This person killed at least 4 women initially. Okay? And disposed of 4 women in the same manner. If you're a cop and you understand that pattern is what gets you caught, you change the pattern. Specifically because it throws people off. Then you have the fact that the person buried bodies on the other side of the county line, right across the county line from Suffolk County, Long Island. Why would you do that? Well, for one, there's a lot of pressure on Suffolk County to solve this crime. You put a body on the other side of the line, the county line, and all of a sudden they get roped into this too. And guess what happens with police departments? They butt heads. Stalls the investigation. Makes it that much harder for these 2 departments just because it's a pride thing at that point. They keep constantly trying to one-up one another. Communication dissolves. It falls through. Right? You're essentially throwing static at them. You're muddying the waters. A cop would know that. A cop would, especially a cop who has experience with that previously in another investigation in their career, would know that the best way to muddy up an investigation is to introduce more than one police department into it. At that point, you now have created a whole new host of problems for the initial organization that was responsible for investigating that crime. The location of the bodies, the brazenness of this person, the MO change, the absence of physical evidence, the outright removal of parts of victims that could be used for common police identification. I think it's a police officer. I think that the Gilgo Beach killer, the List killer, I think it's all one killer. I find it very hard to believe that you would have 2 serial killers operating in the same area, disposing of victims in the same place. I think it's a cop. I think it's somebody who knows how to play the game, and they know exactly what is being looked for, and so they know exactly what not to do. They're intentionally throwing red herrings out and intentionally getting people to focus on other things. And to date, this person has never been caught, and they're getting away with it. I don't know if anybody's going to see this, but I would love to see what your comments are. If you get the chance, go watch. It's a YouTube channel called That Chapter. The gentleman there does crime videos. He has one on Lisk. I would highly recommend watching it. I hope you all have yourselves a nice night. Adios.